to live stream the meeting.
Hey! Can you send me the link?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have actually loaded yet.
This meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Oh, and I can see that we are also actually streaming live on. Okay, everyone's seeing me say this. I'm gonna.
Okay, Tex, we will text you when to start.
Sounds good. I'm going to do a quick walk. Hello, various members of the audience that I cannot see. So welcome to another one of these fantastic workshops put together by Jack and Geneva, who have done a fantastic job filling your mornings, evenings, and afternoons with debating to go alongside the doses of debating that you have already signed up for. Today's session is going to be about rebuttals, a very important part of debating, and I think is something people don't often do very well because there are many different types of rebuttals and many different understandings of what they're meant to do. And I think it's a really interesting topic to get into. So again, I'm talking into the ether. I have no idea if there is an audience. If you do exist, and if you are watching this live, start thinking of some questions you want to ask me about it, because when we did the session yesterday, one of the best parts of that discussion was hearing your questions and getting to talk about it and demonstrate some of that stuff. So in the same way, I am going to talk through some points that I prepared beforehand because I'm a diligent student. But what I really love to do after that is hear some of your questions, and Geneva and Jack will pass those to me. So start typing them in now. There's absolutely no harm putting them in so we can kick things off. All right, so the title of this workshop is refined rebuttals, which I understand Geneva is to blame for. I think it's ironic because actually rebuttals don't need to be very refined. They just need to be quite effective, right? And what I'm going to try and do is explain some of the things that make up effective rebuttal, and then if by the end of it, it also becomes refined, that is very much a bonus. The first question, which I don't think enough people think about, is, before deciding to do some refined rebuttal, what do you even need to rebut? And the way I think of BP debating is a game where each person has 7 minutes and they need to decide what to spend those 7 minutes on, right? It's like going to an auction with a bit of money and thinking like, ooh, what do I really want? And what do I think the judge really wants? And how do I be strategic about it? And that's very much the case with rebuttals. There are many things you could say. If you're an op whip or gov whip, there's literally been 21 minutes, sometimes more, of material to deal with. And you have to figure out what stuff needs your attention and your time. How do you go about deciding that? It kind of depends on the position you're in. It kind of depends on the importance, the impact of an argument, the quality of an argument, whether it's well made, whether it's relevant. So for example, if you're an op whip or gov whip, the biggest rebuttals you need to do are things which protect your extension, things which might outweigh your extension, and anything which might endanger what your partner has said. That's fairly obvious. What about if you're in top half? Well, that's where it begins to depend on, again, the speaker role and the speaker position you're in. So for example, in the top half, I think the Deputy Prime Minister speech is a very unique one because you are the only speech in OG that is responsive to the other side. And one of the worst things that can happen, and I'm sure this has happened to each and every one of you, is if you are in DPM and you stand up and you absolutely destroy the leader of opposition, and then the next speaker, the DLO, comes up and actually reconstructs it really well, and you wish you had a chance to deal with that, and you just didn't, and as a result, you lose the top half. Is it backloading? No. Even if it were, is that allowed? Technically. So that's an example of where you need to think about what to rebut based on the situation you're in, based on the speaker position you're in, and who else is going to come up after you, and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, I think the very act of thinking about this question is going to make all of you much better, because in every debate I've seen so far in this tournament, lots of speakers will rebut things simply because the other side has said them. And that's not necessarily the case. In British parliamentary, judges don't have to credit every single thing that was not rebutted. And if you took a judge test, you would learn that. So question number one to ask yourself all the time, do I need to rebut this? Question number two, how much do I need to rebut this? How much time do I spend on it? And again, it's going to come down to how important it is. So, I'm sure there's a lot of other workshops out there, and I agree with all of them about the different types of rebuttal, right? So sometimes you have counter assertions where one side says sky is blue, and then you say, the sky isn't always blue. Sometimes it's orange when the sun is setting late at night. It just counts as counter assertion. It sounds reasonable. Everyone's seen a sunset, I hope. Is that good rebuttal? It depends. We'll come back to this in a second. So that's what I would call the counter assertion. And then sometimes you have rebuttal that's very much, destroying an argument. So that's where you would say, this was their claim, this was their logic, here's why the logic's wrong. And then finally, you have a class of rebuttal that's become more popular, which is, flipping, quote unquote, flipping the argument, where you take something and actually say, aha, you think you were winning on this. Not only are you not winning on this, we have something that's winning on that ground. So the metric you cared about, that's actually ours. As you might have guessed from what I've said, each of these have their place in debating. Yeah. And it depends on what you are trying to achieve with that rebuttal. So if you're trying to use rebuttal to beat a key claim on the other side, like a kind of big benefit, they spend a lot of time analyzing it, you probably want to either flip it or destroy it. Because if you just counter assert, there's a very good chance the judge will think they've spent a lot of time analyzing this. And even if your counter assertions are somewhat relevant, they may not be true. And it's sort of, there's more confidence that the well-analyzed point is correct. However, there are times where the counter assertion is relevant and is actually very useful. So for example, if a team asserts very generously that something is the case, in order to not let them get away with it, you can quickly counter assert the opposite. If they've made an argument that's strategically very poor, you can counter assert. And the reason you're doing that, by the way, is not because you're intellectually lazy, not because you can't do better, you don't have brains, all of you do. It's because there's a very good chance that argument will be dropped, or there's a very good chance that the argument doesn't require much to be disproved. So for example, if a team says, going back to that example about the sun, the sky is always blue, like always. It can never be anything but blue. All you really need to do to cast some doubt is to say, maybe it's not, right? And if you think about it, if they are the ones trying to make an argument about the sky being blue, as long as you cast some doubt, you're fine, because you've still got your stuff, your own arguments. They're still safe and dry and ready to go. Whereas if they're coming and attacking your material and endangering some of the most crucial stuff you have, then you obviously want to spend more time on it, because that's how you're going to win the debate. So I think that's the second dimension. What do I need to rebut? And the second dimension is, how much time do I need to spend on it? And one of the things I firmly believe in is it's always a shame when speakers put together their speech, not because they've got a plan, but because it just sort of happens. I don't know if you've ever done this. You're doing like a responsive speech and you just have a sheet of paper with everything the member of op has said, and then you just spend your time being like, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. And then you realize, actually, it's 4 minutes and I've run out of time to deal with everyone else. That's because you haven't really put together a conscious plan. And so just answering these two questions together and thinking, how much time do I want to spend on it? Are they worth that attention? Are there other teams that are worth my attention? That's going to unlock a lot of refined rebuttal, as it were. The next question then is, okay, if you figured out you do need to rebut something, you figure out how much time to spend on it, is about figuring out what exactly you are rebutting. This sounds really simple, but it's another pet peeve of mine. Many teams will say things like, in OpWhip, for example, I want to respond to the opening government's argument about lack of choice. For example, in the round that you've just watched about, just participated in about these types of contracts, closing up might very well say, yeah, I'm going to respond to the argument about choice and the lack of choice and coercion. I want to remind you, if the Prime Minister gave that argument, it's been 6 speeches, so about 42 minutes since that was made. What exactly are you responding to about choice? There's a chance OG has said several things on choice. What is the mechanism you're responding to? What is the illustration? What exactly are you trying to deal with, right? And sometimes I see speakers be like, I want to deal with opening government's next point. I mean, next in the sense that they said it afterwards, next in the sense that it's the next thing you wrote down on your paper, And the reason you need to care about this is, if a judge doesn't understand what you're attacking, you're not going to get credit for any of it, right? The worst case scenario is you think you've destroyed an entire set of arguments, but the judge is thinking, hey, you're attacking something completely different. They can't follow anything you're saying, and in the deliberation, it just goes nowhere. So the way I like to think of it is, if I want to be confident of taking something down, I need to be able to describe the target, to say, this is what I'm going for. And in fact, that in itself is a very useful skill, because if I can describe for the judge very clearly what I am attacking, it helps the judge in the deliberation when someone else says, oh, I think this team had this point remaining. The judge is more likely to make the connection and go, I've heard that. I've heard that from the last responsive speech, and there was a response to that. Whereas if you try and disguise all your rebuttal, there's a very good chance all the judges don't realize you've said it. And again, you might try and persuade them after the fact that you did say it, but the result's not going to be changed. The final thing that kind of painting this target allows you to do, and this is a very sneaky trick, but I invite you to try it because it's really fun, is you can begin to describe the other team's case in a way that begins to sound a little bit more silly. So for example, if you wanted to literally quote what they said, you might say, I want to deal with opening government's argument on choice. Whereas you are allowed to say, I want to deal with the opening government's claim that there is no choice in the workplace, despite the fact that there are millions of companies hiring for people at any given time. I've already kind of subtly begun to take a dig at them, right? I've tried to describe their argument. I guess technically that is what they might have said in this last debate. An opening government might have said that actually there is a little employee choice, and it does seem true in the world that there are millions of companies. But just by putting those two things together, I'm already making it sound kind of silly before I then go on to say, actually, it is really silly for these reasons. Not every example will come across like that, but it allows you to start painting a picture of why they are mistaken much better, right? And you might have heard this example from me already in the previous workshop or in one of the feedback sessions I might have given. Debate is a lot like the worst parts of politics. And that's why when politicians describe what their rivals are doing, you will find they describe what their rivals are doing in the most absurd ways. And the truth is it works, right? If not, human history would just turn out very differently. So that's something you can do as well. Okay, that's 3 points now. What do you need to rebut? How much time to spend on it? And what exactly are you rebutting? point number 4 is another pet peeve. Jesus Christ, these are all pet peeves of mine. How do you take them at their best, right? So if I had like $1 for every single time someone has said this and misused it, I suffice to say, I would be, kind of retiring in the Hamptons, as it were, because there's so many times I hear a team say that, say, I'm going to take them at the best, and then go on to do exactly the opposite of that. They nitpick on a terrible piece of logic. They nitpick on an example. They mischaracterize them, or they just rebut them like normal. If you're going to make the whole take them at their best thing work, you have to genuinely take them at the best, because a judge is going to be listening and actually quite skeptical. So no one has ever, despite the number of debaters of my generation who have used this phrase, I think somewhat correctly, sometimes badly, no one has actually tried to define what this is. So I'm going to try and put a stab out there. Hopefully this will also survive, within the debate. What does it mean to take someone at their best? Yeah, here's some simple steps, advice. Number 1, you have to accept their outcomes, logic, and their claims in a relatively strong form, as close as possible to what they literally said, and as close as possible to what they intended. Yeah, and so if you're facing a team that's weaker language-wise, don't nitpick on the fact that they use a phrase that was kind of inconvenient. Like, genuinely think, okay, if best speaker in the world was making this argument, what would the argument be? The second thing you have to accept, other than the logic and the claims, is the language and the characterizations. So if they're using very powerful emotive language, you have to recognize that. If they're using certain examples or real life illustrations, you have to accept that. And how do you then beat that, right? Because it feels like you're conceding a lot of ground. I mean, yeah, you are. That's why it's so powerful if you do it right. What you have to do to beat it is, rather than dispute any of these things, because disputing any of these things is not taking them at their best, you need to introduce an idea, a concept, a characterization, a frame, a fact about the world that no one in the debate had yet considered. Something completely new, a new ingredient that shows when you put all those things together, your side has an advantage, right? So it's a very simple template. If you ever feel like after you've said, I'm going to take them at their best, you're following it up with a rebuttal that says, the logic's not true, or the illustration's false, or the language is silly, that's not right. You should be saying, I'm going to take them at their best. Here's their claim. Here's their biggest impact. What everyone has missed is this thing is going to happen, this other thing. And because the other thing's happening, that's either going to fall flat, it's not as big as you thought, or actually that might even be a bad thing, right? Because that's what literally what taking them at their best means, accepting every part of that. So I don't know how many people are watching this. It'll be interesting to see if this starts popping up. But I do genuinely think if you do this well, it will, judges will actually appreciate it, because it forces you as well not to rely on weak responses. It forces you to engage with the heart of that idea, and sometimes go even further than that. All right, that's 4 points. Let's get to the 5th point before I get some questions, because I want to hear from you guys. How do you break deadlocks? Again, hear this all the time. I'm going to break the deadlock in top half. Very often it isn't actually a deadlock. Like, a judge is going to come to a decision one way or the other. As in every BP debate where I've heard someone say we're going to break a deadlock, a call still appears. So presumably there is no deadlock. But another thing that's interesting about BP is that, unlike, say, the 3-on-3 format, which has a higher emphasis on this, it is seldom about winning the tennis match of responses back and forth, right? Deadlocks are very rarely broken by being the last person to speak, because if they were, CO would win more than it already does. Likewise, OO in top half, etc., etc. Instead, the way to break a deadlock is actually very similar to what I've said about taking them at their best. You need to introduce something different that replaces, I suppose that. And I guess I should have really thought about this a little bit more, but when you look at how big changes happen in culture, in sports, in the meta of professional sports or whatnot, it's not that a deadlock is broken because something better just comes along and everyone just goes, yeah, that is just better. Okay, so what does that just better look like? It could be a characterization that tells a story that no other team had been able to tell. It could be explaining the facts of the debate. Every team agrees that there's some facts which are true, and actually there's a better theory that explains it. And suddenly you go like, oh yeah, that theory does explain everything we've talked about so far. One way or the other, it's about substituting something that's more compelling. And that actually takes me to my final sort of observation. Sometimes, in British parliamentary in particular, rebuttal is a new substantive idea. And this is why we often say rebuttal can be valid extension. Because if you break a deadlock, or if you break a point and introduce a response that's substituting a characterization, that's introducing a bigger concept, that is essentially positive material, right? The line is blurred. And that is how you should think about responsiveness as new material as well, right? It's substituting a new big idea. It's obviously not going to be counter assertions. It's not going to be a series of small things, but it can very much be a positive contribution in the debate. Right, that is all I've prepared. I hope desperately there are questions, although if there are none, I will also just be able to kind of chill for a bit. But short summary, always ask yourself when you're in any rebuttal speech, what do you need to rebut? How much time to spend on it? What exactly am I rebutting, and have I made it clear? Am I taking them at their best? And how do I break a deadlock if there is indeed one, instead of using, tennis responses back and forth. Cool. Don't see any questions in chat, so I'm going to awkwardly mill around to see if any come through. Well, if there are no questions, Geneva, does that mean, oh, okay. What's the best way to rebut fast content heavy speakers who try to run lots of material? How do you get better at actually prioritizing? One way you can beat them is to also be very fast. There are some ways you can train to speak very fast, among which you obviously have to have quite a clean, slightly controversial, by the way, a clean, unaccented voice, because strong accents, regardless of whether they're white or not, so a Scottish accent is a great example of this, are just harder to follow for the average international listener. So if you are confident that you have a very clean, neutral accent, you can try and speak very fast. You always run the risk that someone will miss out on what you're saying. But hey, there you go. It's a risk you run. The other thing that helps you speak faster is just to be like really clear and crisp on your consonants. So if you are really good at making your words sound really crisp, almost like a drama theater performer would, you can actually up your speed. But I suspect that is not how most people are going to try to beat these speakers. A lot of fast content speakers, they say a lot without actually saying very much. And I think that is because they either have to write a lot beforehand and there's just not enough time in debating to do that, or they are saying very fast as a way of compensating for kind of trying to get through a lot. And the way to rebut that is to do a very good job at point number 3 that I was talking about. Because if they say 10 things and you can summarize that accurately and say, here is exactly what they're going for, here is the exact reason they give, this is what their reasons all have in common, and that is why that is wrong, you're basically taking all that speed and like cramming it into a single pressure point. And if you can attack that pressure point, that is also going to destroy the logic. Now, let's be honest, there are some very good speakers in the world who can speak very fast and also just cover a lot of material. I mean, at that point, you're looking at like a world's top 5 speaker. So the way to beat them is just try and get that skill as well. But I think for the vast majority of very fast speakers, that is the way to deal with them. Next question, can you run rebuttals only while in closing? What does the judge manual say? The judge manual says yes. And in practice, also yes. I mean, strictly speaking, I presume what you mean by this question is, can you run rebuttals only and win? I mean, it depends on what type of rebuttals you use. So if all the rebuttals you make are explaining why other teams are wrong, it's rare. Yeah, it's rare to win on the basis of that alone, unless other teams in the round are significantly worse. Why is that? Because even if you show that a team is wrong 99% of the time, that 1% of value might still be worth, taking a punt on. But having rebuttal that deepens, that frames, and enables other arguments to become more powerful is more than match winning. It's like it's exactly the kind of thing you should be going for. So this is where what is the distinction between a rebuttal and just a new idea that also happens to clash? At some point, calling it a rebuttal is a bit meaningless, and really what you want to be thinking is, do my rebuttals, if I'm calling them rebuttals, do they have interesting, original, authentic, illustrative value? And is it a contribution to the debate that's going to make our team and our side sound better? And if the answer is yes, doesn't matter if they're rebuttals, doesn't matter if they're new arguments, whatever you call them, you'll do well. Question 3, when you are GovWhip, how do you quickly decide what the important material to rebut from CO extension is? Fantastic. I would also add to this question by saying, when you are DPM, how do you do that for LO? Because it's functionally the same. Number one, you need to have some sense of what their intentions are. And I use this phrase very deliberately. This is literally how I think about it. So I guess it's thinking, okay, this speaker, whether it's the LO or whether it's the member of op, they're trying to do something. There's a good chance they're probably not doing it very well, right? I mean, no disrespect, but it's just like, no speaker is that perfect. And especially when you're not quite sure what they're going for, that's precisely the scenario where you have to infer. What are they trying to achieve? How are they trying to win the debate? Because you can be confident they think they've done it and their whip is going to try and do that as well. So another way of framing that is try and think if, I don't know, like Ashish and MDG were running that argument in CO, exact same argument, how would they run it, right? Or some other team that you think is going to run it in a pretty good form. You could pick any series of Worlds, Euros teams, whatever. Bearing that in mind, what rebuttals can you make that actually deal with that very strong version of the case? And this is where I think you will push yourself, not just to give responses like states might not have the resources to do this. That's a very simple response. It's easy to show that states will have the resources. A much more fundamental response is to say, for instance, actually, it's a really bad idea if states do this, or to try and flip it and say, actually, states are less likely to do this on your side of the house. Something that's much more fundamental and actually, attacks the heart of the argument they're making. And sometimes this means that you will have to make this attack, you might even have to ignore the logic of the other side. So if a first opposition speaker comes up and gives very poor logic, but makes some big assertions about fairly big important arguments, I would, rather than spend my time saying, you don't actually prove all that, and it's not necessarily true, your arguments don't work. What's the point of that? Because the next speaker might come in and fill those gaps, and then I'd be sitting there thinking like, oh, if only I'd done something better. So it's almost like forcing yourself to think, what is the strongest response I can give to the strongest version of this? And you can still do the small stuff because the other side still should have to patch the holes, but it's always trying to force yourself to do something more fundamental, something that actually challenges the heart of that argument. What questions do you ask yourself when trying to think of rebuttals? Ooh. I mean, I did just do a bit of the workshop being like, how much time to spend on it and whatnot. Those questions all are relevant. And I do genuinely spend a lot of my time asking that because, again, feel free to follow up, but I think it depends on whether the issue you're asking is, how do I think of rebuttal? Versus, assuming I have some rebuttal, what questions do I ask myself about how to deploy it? So if it's the former, how do I think of rebuttal? What I try and do is go, okay, are there some broad overarching reasons why this is just not really true, right? So in that case, I'll just kind of counter assert. Then I might ask myself, okay, they think this thing is, they believe something is true. What are the reasons they give for that? What exactly are the reasons? Can I understand those reasons? Because if you're trying to rebut something without really understanding it and being able to summarize it, you're just going to go nowhere. So you understand it and then you think, is there anything wrong with this? Like, is it compelling? Is it not? And if it is compelling, maybe it is very compelling, then you move on to the next question. The next question being, is this actually good? So sometimes I go like, I can't really deal with the logic of this. It seems quite obvious. Can I say it's bad? And then I try and deal with that, right? So I think there's no hard and fast rule, and you get better with practice. But those are some of the things I would think through. Do I need to respond to it? How much time should I respond to it? Should I be trying to destroy it completely? Should I be trying to deflect it? Should I be trying to flip it? And depending on which you go for, is it? Do I believe it? Is it true? Does the average reasonable person think it's true? I mean, that's another interesting one where like sometimes I hear an argument that just makes a lot of logical debate sense. It's like, in debate land, this might be true. But I feel like my mom wouldn't believe it, And then you start asking, okay, but if my mom wouldn't believe it, why? Why exactly? And then if you can find that, you're home free and you just get to be like, yeah, the average person really wouldn't believe that. And I think it's because my mom would think, well, you take that bit out, but you essentially say, my mom would say, what do you mean intellectual epistemic access? And they'd be like, yeah, actually, my mom would know what that means. And so, that's an inroad to attacking the argument. That's not in it. Please don't go into debate tomorrow and say like, my mom thinks this. Like, that's not enough. But it's a thought experiment to help you think, if I wasn't a debater, would I find this persuasive? And it helps you understand where the ordinary person might come from. Yeah, sorry, that was a funny one. Is that all the questions we've got? Alrighty. Well, I hope that was useful in some way, shape, or form. If you have any follow-up questions or want to chat, do let me know. Otherwise, I imagine most of you are exhausted after 4 debate rounds. So rest well and best of luck for the rest of the tournament. Thanks again to Geneva and Jack. See you all soon. Bye.